On the 5th of November 1605, the residents of Southwark, startled, ran out into the street. The explosion must have been a large one, but people struggled to place which direction it could have come from. A rumour quickly spread that the armoury at the Tower of London, not far away on the other side of the Thames River, had exploded. They were mistaken, for as they looked westward, they saw a billowing cloud of smoke rise into the air. An explosion under the Houses of Parliament had destroyed the ancient Palace of Westminster and much of nearby Westminster Abbey. The 100-year-old Lady Chapel built by Henry VII had completely gone. Water spilled in from the Thames and flooded a huge crater, in which now floated the remains of buildings and bodies. Somewhere in amongst the ruinous remains were the broken bodies of the King, Queen, and Prince of Wales. The explosion had happened during the state opening of Parliament and had destroyed not just the building in which Parliament met, but the entire personal body of the government. Or so history could have read if the biggest terrorist attack planned on British soil had been successfully carried out. My name is Philippa Lacey Brewell, and this is my talk for the Stuarts Online History Festival 2024. The Gunpowder Plot, Oppression and Broken Promises, the Roadmap to the Planning of an Atrocity. If the planned attack of 5th of November 1605 at the Houses of Parliament had been successful, hundreds of people, including senior members of the royal family, the entire ruling class and many innocent bystanders, would have been killed or injured. As well as the human death toll, it cannot be understated how significant the damage would have been both to the physical and political landscape of a country which relied upon a system of governance which, although evolving, was based on centuries of tradition. In this talk, I'm going to take a look at what might have driven the conspirators behind the plot to plan such an extreme act. The prevention of the so-called Gunpowder Plot is still commemorated in the UK each year on the anniversary of the plot's discovery. An Act of Thanksgiving was passed by Parliament within months of the foiled attack on Parliament, decreeing that special church services of Thanksgiving be held each 5th of November, where congregations who were compelled to attend gave thanks for the failure of the plotters. The church services were, of course, Anglican. Catholic worship had been effectively banned over the previous century, which had seen huge top-down changes imposed on the people of England and Wales in how they were expected to worship in their Christian faith. 100 years before the Gunpowder Plot, there had been only one form of Christianity, Roman Catholicism. But as the 16th century drew to a close, those following the old faith had to hide their devotion in fear of persecution. Many people had switched to the new religion, but a few, who could afford the fines levied on recusants, that is, those who refused to attend Church of England services, took a stand and continued to refuse to adopt the new faith. Religious schism had begun in the 1530s, when Henry VIII severed the English Church from the Church in Rome. Frustrated at needing the unforthcoming permission of the Pope to dissolve his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, he renounced the overlordship of the Pope and appointed himself head of the Church in England. The Act of Succession, passed in 1534, required all of Henry VIII's subjects to swear to accept him in his new role and renounce the Pope. This changed a millennia of accepted practice, and for some, it was a change their consciences could not allow. These included leading figures in Henry's own court, the subsequently canonised Sir Thomas More and Bishop Fisher, who were both beheaded in 1535 on Tower Hill. Henry's subjects had a stark choice: submit to their sovereign or to the Pope in Rome. In other words, be a loyal subject or look to a foreign power and risk being considered a traitor. What had begun as a personal matter of conscience for Henry had morphed into a state intervention in the way his subjects must practice their faith. It was not just a matter of religion, but of good, loyal citizenship. Under Henry VIII's children, the pendulum of religious practice had swung hard in opposing directions. First with Protestantism under Edward VI, and then with an attempt to bring the country back to Roman Catholicism under Mary I. After the turmoil of her siblings' reigns, Henry's final child, Elizabeth I, had wished to tread a careful line on religion. But as is always the case when trying to please everyone, you satisfy none. She maintained too much of the ritual of the old religion for fervent reformists, but not enough ancient church tradition for Catholics. Despite her intention to not open windows into men's souls, her council had no such qualms, and legislation passed within months of her accession paved the way for practising Catholics to be condemned as traitors. The persecution of Catholics under Elizabeth I was real and brutal. Mary I, Elizabeth's sister and immediate predecessor, had repealed their father's Act of Supremacy, which had declared him supreme head of the Church, and one of the first bills to pass through the House of Lords of Elizabeth's reign was the Second Act of Supremacy, which declared the English monarch as supreme governor of the Church in England, a subtle but important change to the title Elizabeth's father had assumed. The legislation, passed in early 1559, abolished papal supremacy over the Church in England. It also banned Mass, a central act of worship for Catholics, and prescribed a requirement for anyone taking public or church positions to swear allegiance to Elizabeth in her role as Supreme Governor of the Church in England. If someone did not, this was considered a criminal offence, and in 1562 this offence was elevated to a treason. Eventually, all members of Parliament and those studying at university were also required to swear the oath. The oath, which included the words to utterly renounce and forsake all foreign jurisdictions, powers, superiorities and authorities, and do promise that from henceforth I shall bear faith and true allegiance to the Queen's Highness, meant that by the letter of the law, to be an English Roman Catholic was a contradiction in terms. To be a Roman Catholic loyal to his Queen was an impossible concept. Are you loyal to your Queen or not? If you are not, then you are automatically suspected a traitor. Being English and a Catholic was a particularly acute problem for Elizabeth and her subjects. Catholic Europe had chosen not to accept Elizabeth as Queen of England, despite her being named in the wills of both Henry VIII and Mary I. The basis for this rejection was Elizabeth's illegitimacy, according to the Roman Catholic Church, who had expressly denied Henry's plea for a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and therefore did not recognise his second marriage, that to Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn. Catholic Europe instead thought another candidate more worthy, someone of legitimate royal blood, who was descended from Henry VII of England and whose Catholic credentials were watertight. She, of course, was Mary, Queen of Scots. Whilst Mary was sitting on the throne over the northern border of England in Scotland, she was enough of a concern to Elizabeth. But after a series of disastrous decisions which resulted in civil war, Mary had fled to England in 1568, leaving behind her baby son James, who she had been forced to abdicate in favour of. Now, Elizabeth's most dangerous rival was on English soil. The presence of Mary, Queen of Scots in England would prove increasingly dangerous for both queens. In 1570, Pope Pius V issued a papal bull excommunicating Elizabeth, releasing English Catholics from their allegiance to the Queen and calling for her forcible removal. This did not help the situation for English Catholics, and Elizabeth's government retaliated with higher fines for anyone who didn't attend Anglican services, and in 1585 a blatantly retrospective piece of legislation was passed stating that any priest who'd been ordained abroad since 1559 was automatically a traitor if found in England. A person harbouring a priest was also condemned as a traitor, and treason carried the death sentence. Around 130 priests and 60 lay people were executed under these laws during Elizabeth's reign. 29-year-old Catholic convert Margaret Clithero would be one of them. Margaret, a mother of 3 children, had converted to Catholicism in 1574. In order to hear Mass, which was now against the law, Margaret harboured priests at her home on the Shambles in York. She also set up a small school to teach the Catholic faith to children. When she sent her eldest son abroad, suspicions were raised. He had, in fact, gone to train as a priest. Soon, Margaret's house was searched by authorities who found priest hides, and she was arrested. Knowing that if she made a plea, the case would be brought to trial and witnesses would be called, including her own children, she decided not to. The penalty was horrific. And I should point out at this point that if you'd like to skip ahead a short while, you do not necessarily need to hear about the execution of Margaret, although the brutality of it is relevant to this story. On the 25th of March 1586, Good Friday and the Feast of Annunciation, Margaret was brought to the toll booth on the Ouse Bridge over the Ouse River, which flows through the city of York. For refusing to plea, her punishment was death by crushing. This particularly cruel method saw the 29-year-old woman, pregnant with her 4th child, stripped naked, lay face up with a fist-sized rock placed in the middle of her spine. Her own front door lay on top of her, and weights placed on top of it to crush her to death. The city's usual executioners refused to do it, instead paying some desperate beggars to carry out the sentence for them. She died after around 15 slow, excruciating minutes, and her body was left there for 6 hours. There was widespread shock at the execution of this young mother, and the injustice of it only hardened some Catholics against those who they saw as clearly carrying out the devil's work. In the crowd that day, watching Margaret's martyrdom, may have been a 16-year-old boy who lived only a few streets away from the Clitheros in Stonegate. His name was Guy Fawkes. Rank was no protection from the death penalty, and the following year Mary, Queen of Scots, after being strongly implicated in a plot to overthrow Elizabeth, was executed, and the Scottish King James VI was now an orphan. The danger, both perceived and real, from Catholics within and outside England grew. The year after Mary's execution, Philip II of Spain, Elizabeth's one-time brother-in-law, launched an invasion attempt supported by the Duke of Parma. The 1588 Spanish Armada was defeated, but paranoia around a Catholic threat grew further. Some, such as Sir Thomas Tresham, a well-known Catholic recusant knighted by Elizabeth at Kenilworth in 1575, and who had been imprisoned many times, maintained that he could be both loyal to the Pope and his Queen simultaneously. Although he was never executed, by the time of his death he had little to leave his son and heir Francis. Such were the financial penalties for holding such a principled position. The execution of Margaret Clithero had hardened the resolve of some Catholics to remain in their faith despite the consequences, whilst simultaneously holding out hope that circumstances would change on the death of Elizabeth. In fact, conversions to Catholicism were still known. One such person to convert was the young man who may have witnessed Margaret Clithero's death, Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes had been born in York in 1570 and christened in the city where his father was a prominent Protestant figure. His father died, however, when Guy was just 8 years old. His mother remarried a Catholic man, and although it's not clear how much religious influence he had on Guy, Guy did convert to Catholicism at some point before reaching the age of 21, when he sold the property he had inherited at his coming of age and enlisted in the Catholic Spanish army. In Spain, he changed his name to Guido and spent 10 years fighting for the Spanish, where he became well versed in the use of explosives. As anti-Catholic measures grew back in England, an equal and opposite effect occurred in the remaining faithful, pushing some into rebellion. The Essex Rebellion of 1601, named after its protagonist, the vainglorious, entitled and humility baron, stepson of Elizabeth's favourite Robert Dudley, a man called Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, attracted a small band of supporters who, in their echo chamber of discontent, had persuaded themselves that their feelings and frustrations represented those of the general populace, and that particularly London would rise up in support of their cause and against their Queen of 42 years. Some disaffected young Catholic men had been attracted to the cause. One of them was a nobleman called Robert Catesby, along with Francis Tresham, son of Sir Thomas Tresham, and Catesby's friends, the brothers Robert and Thomas Winter. The rebellion was crushed, Essex was executed, and those thought to have had only a minor role were fined. Thus Catesby, Tresham, and the Winter brothers were freed. Elizabeth I had always actively avoided naming her successor, believing that men were always wont to worship the rising and not the setting sun. However, as her health began to fade in the early years of the 17th century, men nevertheless began to turn in the direction of the sun they believed would rise, the Scottish king and son of the Queen Elizabeth had executed, James VI of Scotland. Henry Percy, 9th Earl of Northumberland, who was from an old Catholic family, sent his second cousin Thomas Percy to visit the Scottish court and secure an audience with James. By 1602, he had represented Northumberland to the King of Scotland on at least 3 occasions. He had heard assurances from James that, on becoming King of England, he would not only end the persecution of Catholics, but also stop the barring of them from many professions which it required practitioners to swear the oath of allegiance to the Protestant faith. Nothing, crucially, was ever recorded in writing. English Catholics conceived that their king-in-waiting was a moderate, and many believed that his new regime would allow them to once again practice their faith without fear. The prominent Catholic, the impoverished Sir Thomas Tresham, was the first to declare for James in Northamptonshire following the death of Elizabeth, doing so at Northampton on the 25th of March 1603. James, who had been King of Scotland for over 3 decades, made his way through his new domain, headed for the capital, London, accompanied by the son and heir of Elizabeth I's Chief Minister, William Cecil, Robert Cecil. Along the journey, James made various stops and, as was customary for a new monarch, would sanction the release of selected prisoners. However, none of the freed men included any of the Jesuit priests languishing in jail, having been arrested for trying to convert people to Catholicism during Elizabeth's reign. This was a major disappointment to James's new Catholic subjects. Further disappointment was to come. The uncovering of a plot to kidnap James and the receipt of a rosary from the Pope to his new wife Queen Anne persuaded him, no doubt with significant and pointed guidance from his new English Principal Secretary Robert Cecil, to not interfere with the established laws and structures of the land. Persecution and intolerance would continue. The byplot and the main plot, as they became to be known, were uncovered before James had even been crowned. The byplot had looked to kidnap the king and make demands for religious toleration. The main plot, however, had been far more serious. That plan was to kill the king and replace him with his cousin, Arbella Stuart. The plots didn't get past the discussion stage, but when they were discovered, it raised fears of further backlash against Catholics. Jesuit Principal Robert Persons had assured the plotters that the Spanish backing they had hoped for would not be forthcoming. Continental Catholic powers, including the Pope, were getting weary of failed Catholic uprisings in England. They were also unimpressed that English Catholics had accepted James only to now complain that he was not adhering to their expectations, which they had not held him to, in order for him to secure the English throne. persons warned that the discovery of any further plots would lead to further repression and that the Pope himself was advising against any further rash action. Around the same time, Sir Thomas Tresham led a delegation of leading Catholic figures to see the new king at Hampton Court Palace, where they presented him with a proclamation of allegiance signed by a large number of leading Catholic laity. In response, James assured them that fines for recusancy would be stopped and that Catholics would no longer be barred from the highest positions in the land. James reversed this decision, however, when the Crown funds, already struggling to maintain James's lavish lifestyle, had a £7,000 gap in revenue usually raised from them. Removal of the fines had also led to the numbers of people attending church to decline, and James feared an explosion in the number of Catholics if he showed leniency. So despite the promised tolerance, English Catholics continued to be fined for non-church attendance and barred from certain professions and roles in government. Against this background, desperation and treason brewed. Robert Catesby came from a well-known recusant Catholic family. His father William had been imprisoned and later executed at Tyburn for hiding a priest. Robert himself had been fined £3,000 for his part in the Essex Rebellion. In 1604, Catesby began to form a secret plan to blow up the Houses of Parliament on the day of the state opening. On this day, King James and his wife Queen Anna and his son Prince Henry would all be in attendance, as well as every member of the House of Lords and members of Parliament. Gunpowder would be placed below the Palace of Westminster, where Parliament convened, and lit at the correct time to inflict the greatest damage. In the ensuing chaos, James's 9-year-old daughter, Princess Elizabeth, would be kidnapped and installed as queen, and a new Catholic government created that would actually govern the country in her name. Over the course of 1604 and 1605, Catesby recruited other men, including Thomas Winter, who then travelled to the continent to find out if there would be any Spanish interest in supporting the plot. There was not. Spain remained with the same attitude expressed following the earlier plots to kidnap the king. Catesby, not dissuaded by a lack of Spanish backing, continued to plot. Whilst on the continent, Winter had met an Englishman who had been fighting as a mercenary for Catholic Spain for the past 10 years, Guy Fawkes, now referring to himself by the Spanish equivalent of his name, Guido. Guy was recruited to the cause, bringing with him a decade worth of experience in explosives. The group grew, and amongst others included 2 brothers who had been educated with Guy Fawkes back in York, where all of them may have witnessed the execution of Margaret Clithero. Their names were Christopher and John Wright. Francis Tresham, whose father Thomas, the architect of Rushden Triangular Lodge, whose secrets are still to be decoded in full, lent financial backing to the plan. The promises made to his father from James after the audience at Hampton Court Palace had come to nothing, and now his son joined in Catesby's conspiracy. The possibility of a plot seems to have been something of an open secret within Catholic circles, most of the major Catholic families being related by blood or marriage. Anne Vaux, a well-known Catholic recusant and relation to Francis Tresham by marriage, apparently expressed fears that these wild hearts had something in hand. It is worth noting, then, that this group of men do not appear to have had direct support for any plot from within the Catholic network of noble families in England, and indeed many may have been concerned with what action these men might take. Had they have had any actual knowledge of a plot to destroy Parliament, where many Catholic peers still sat in the House of Lords, they would have known that their own close relatives were likely to be killed. Vaux, who was a close follower of Father Henry Garnet, a Jesuit priest with links to Catesby, begged him to talk to him and persuade him against any extreme course of action. Indeed, some of the conspirators themselves expressed concern over how many innocent lives would be lost as a direct consequence of the explosion. Catesby, however, is someone that nowadays we may categorise as an ideologically driven terrorist. His beliefs were so strong in the cause that any action was justified, even killing fellow Catholics and innocent bystanders. The plan continued to develop and was eventually put into action. The state opening of Parliament was delayed twice in 1605 due to plague, which had ravaged the city. The conspirators may have been reminded of the lack of compassion James had shown to Catholic prisoners in the summer of 1603, when an outbreak of plague had been so severe that all prisoners had been pardoned and released from its prisons, that was, except those who had been arrested for their part in the main and by-plots, and Catholics. In May 1605, Thomas Percy, a cousin of the Earl of Northumberland and a conspirator in the plot, rented a house next to the Palace of Westminster, the ancient seat of government and the place in which Parliament still met. The conspirators got to work digging a tunnel underneath the palace. Progress was slow, and when the opportunity arose to rent a cellar underneath the palace, they took it. The state opening of Parliament was now planned for the 5th of November, but, anticipating the original earlier date, Guy Fawkes had already placed 36 barrels of gunpowder in the rented cellar in July. 36 barrels, when ignited, would cause a large enough explosion to destroy Westminster Palace, Westminster Hall, the Abbey, and much of the surrounding area, killing hundreds and hundreds of people in the vicinity, including not just members of the royal family and nobility, but ordinary people there with petitions and people who'd come out to see their king. On the 26th of October, a Catholic peer, Lord Monteagle, received an alarming letter which warned him not to attend the opening of Parliament, for it was to receive a blow. He ignored its instructions to burn the letter and immediately took it to Robert Cecil, who took it to the king, who, it was later claimed due to his divine powers of deduction, had deciphered the letter's meaning. A search of the rooms below Parliament was ordered, but nothing unusual was discovered except the guards did come across a man named John Johnson, who identified himself and informed them that he was a manservant of Thomas Percy, who was storing winter fuel in the vault. Percy was, of course, well known to be Catholic, and this roused suspicion. On a second search, barrels of gunpowder were found in the vault along with Mr. Johnson, who was arrested and confessed immediately that he was there to blow up Parliament and kill the king. He was taken to the Tower of London. The king gave permission for torture to be used to question this man to find out who he was working with, but all he would give up was his real name, Guy Fawkes. Who had sent the letter? His brother-in-law, Francis Tresham, was one of the conspirators and may have told Monteagle about the plot, or, as the accepted story has become, wrote the slimly disguised warning to him to stop him going to Parliament that day. It was such a risky and stupid move from Tresham that some have speculated that Monteagle, already having some knowledge of the plot, dictated it himself to find a way to make his knowledge of it known without implicating himself. Further suggestions are that this wasn't the only letter, but that other recipients had burned their letters, in which case it was not more likely to be Tresham than anyone who knew someone else who would be attending Parliament that day. With the plot foiled and Guy Fawkes in custody, some of the remaining conspirators rode north. Either still in belief of their cause or in pure desperation, they knocked on the doors of people they thought would be sympathetic to the Catholic cause as they went, telling them that the plot had been successful and asking them to join their uprising. People did not respond. Despite the failure of the first key part of their plan, their aim still seems to have been to kidnap the Princess Elizabeth, who was at Coventry in the Midlands. On the 6th of November, the conspirators reached Warwick Castle and raided it for fresh horses, weapons and gunpowder. However, by now the Sheriff of Worcester was on their trail. At the Tower of London, Guy Fawkes had held up well under torture, only admitting to his own name in the hope that his fellow conspirators would still succeed somehow. When he heard that they had failed, he confessed and gave up their names. The majority of the group moved to Holbeach House in Shropshire, but the Sheriff of Worcester was in pursuit. The gunpowder they had stolen from Warwick Castle had become damp. It was useless unless dry, and in a desperate attempt to dry it out, it was laid in front of the fire. A stray spark set it alight, and some of the group were injured and one of them blinded in the resultant explosion. Wounded, desperate, and unsure if God had forsaken them, the men resolved to fight to the death. In the shootout which was to follow, 4 of the men were shot dead by the Sheriff of Worcester's men, including the gang leader, Catesby. Eventually, all of the remaining conspirators were caught and taken to London, where they were tried and eventually executed for treason. Had the gunpowder exploded, Catesby's plot would have succeeded in destroying from the root up the institution, personage, and written record required to govern the country. Yet the conspirators seem to have convinced themselves that what they were doing was changing those in the ruling class, those infected with wrongthink and foreigners, which could be replaced. The lack of a real plan for what would have happened following the explosion speaks to the blinkered radicalism of the men involved. Catesby's plan was one of dogmatic conviction over reality. There was a lack of support within the country, and certainly no backing from Spain or the Pope. However, a power vacuum of the magnitude would have been caused could have brought decisive action from Spain or another foreign power to invade and assume control of a country floundering like a ship without a rudder, sail, captain or crew, and if I may take my metaphor further, no knowledge of how to fix or sail the ship. And so, it is difficult to find a scenario in which the Gunpowder Plot would ever have met its aims. The ramifications, though difficult to define, would certainly have spread far and wide. At the actual time, throughout England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland, maybe even Europe, and across time to us. With the passage of time, the Gunpowder Plot has become legend, with the inevitable romanticism of a good story told again and again. But at the heart of it was desperate men captured by a belief so strong that the end justified the means. Thank you for listening.